it's Lee from ColouringQueen.net, and today I thought we'd have a colouring story, and I'd colour in my Four Seasons colouring book again. So yeah, I'm going to use my Prismacolors today, and also I'm going to use some little nail stickers that I've had lying around, and I thought I'd use those up and put flowers on her dress because, you know, I'm lazy. Anyway, I hope you guys are doing well today. I've actually been a little bit out of sorts for the last couple of days. I had my second vaccine on Sunday, and it's Wednesday now, and on Monday my arm felt like I'd had a brick thrown on it, and I was so tired. I got all the fluey effects. And I'm sorry about Millie jumping in here. You can see her little bit of a tail. Anyway, I had all the fluey effects, and I ended up having like 4 naps and spending like 10 hours just asleep. And yeah, yesterday I was okay, felt normal, and then today I'm back to feeling tired and lethargic again, and quite frankly, I hope I don't fall asleep doing this. But I did actually have a nap, a couple of hours ago, so maybe I'm due for another nap. I'd love to know if anyone else got totally fatigued with it. I just feel so tired, it's unbelievable. Anyway, hopefully it'll pass soon. I think the second one's worse than the first one, and of course David had to come and hold my hand again and go through the whole anxiety-ridden adventure for me. At least it's done now. We're getting all our stuff organised at home because David's family is coming up for Christmas, but that's been the go for the last couple of years, which has been cancelled. But thankfully I don't need to do any Christmas shopping because I've got the gifts from last year, and every time I thought that they were getting them, they had to cancel at the last minute. So at least, I've done the Christmas shopping, but unfortunately because of David's mum's change in her diet and her health, I don't know what on earth to cook for Christmas dinner, but at least I've got a little bit of time to think about it. But I'll have to get an update on all the things that she's now not allowed to have, and I really don't know what we'll be eating because, she's not allowed salt, and she's not allowed certain breads or certain milks or butter, and she doesn't like other things, so I don't know. I'm really lost. And just an update on my hand before I forget. Some people do ask me about it. Went to the doctor the other day, and I still have to wear my mitten, as I call it, for another couple of weeks. I'm getting an ultrasound in a couple of days, and hopefully then they'll have a bit more detail, but doctor seems to think that the tendon from my thumb upwards is the one that's really damaged. And it's been, I think, 7-8 weeks now in the mitten, and yeah, not getting any better really, and I don't notice any change, so I hope they've got some sort of solution when I get this ultrasound done on Friday. I couldn't get an earlier appointment, which is annoying, but anyway, hopefully on Friday or a couple of days later when the results come back from the imaging, I'll get something to tell me where we're going with this. I'd really love to get the thing off. I have to wear it like 24 hours a day except for when I have a shower or when I wash up, and washing up is a nightmare because I have to balance sort of the plates on the sink to get them washed because I can't hold anything. It's just, I can't wait to be rid of it. I know there's worse problems to have, but I'm really sick of the mitten. But anyway, today's colour and story is one of my favourite cases, probably from Australia. Might be my second favourite cases, but it's definitely one that outlines all the things that I love about law, and that's the problem-solving aspect and the need to think laterally and creatively to come up with solutions. And I know some people hate lawyers that do this, but it is their job. And, in today's case, it's a prime example of problem solving and also thinking a bit creatively and laterally, which I really like. I really like that aspect of things. Anyway, today's little story takes place in the state of Tasmania in Australia. Now, a poor little Tassie, it's called the Apple Isle. It's often left out of maps completely. It's that little island at the bottom of Australia. And in Australia, we call it Tassie. And it's actually the 26th largest island in the world. Tasmania is an actually absolutely beautiful place. And please excuse me today, I am so tired. I don't even know what I'm saying half the time. But back to the story. Tasmania is a beautiful place, and 500,000 odd people live there, and they love that island. And one of the reasons they love it is the large amount of natural wilderness on it. Actually, about 42% of the island is natural wilderness or national parks, and that makes it a popular tourist destination as well as an idyllic place to live. I've only been to Tassie once for a holiday with David. Oh gosh, it'd probably be nearly 20 years ago, and it was definitely beautiful and definitely worth a second visit. I can't believe we haven't been back. I think it must be nearly 20 years since I've been there. And there's just so much to see and do there, and it's so easy to get around. And if you like art or history, it's got both of those things in spades. It's a really, really beautiful place. Every place, no matter how idyllic in the Western world, needs some modern bits and bobs to tick along. And one of those things is electricity. And in the 1980s, the government of Tasmania planned a hydroelectricity scheme. So this was needed for the state to bulk up its own electricity supply. It already was using hydroelectricity. Actually, since the early 1900s, it was one of the first places to harness the power of hydroelectricity. It also needed its own electricity supply. In the meantime, it was being supplied from the mainland, so from the main part of Australia, through the small state of Victoria, which is sort of across the water, across the Bass Strait from Tasmania. So they had to pay for that extra. But in order to have a hydroelectricity scheme, you need a dam to collect water. Then that water is pumped through pipes and it's released and flows back down through these turbines and through the river, and energy is created through this process. But to make it work, you need an area that has a river. So the government found that they had an area of Crown land, and Crown land is just a fancy pants way of saying it's government owned land and it hasn't been sold on to anybody else. And fortunately they had this spot of land that they could use to build a hydroelectricity facility, and it had water in the form of the Franklin River. And we need water to make the hydroelectricity. So the government wanted to harness these natural resources and build the Franklin Dam out to service the hydroelectricity scheme. This means that they'd solve the electrical problem, but it would actually cause flooding over a large section of land, and it would damage the area. And that area was surrounded with native wildlife, beautiful natural landscapes, and it would also damage an area of cultural significance to the Aboriginal community. Now back in the 1980s, that wasn't as played out in the media as much as it would be if you did it today, but it was still important. So I remember seeing on TV when I was a youngster, and showing my age now, protesters for the construction of the dam. And they would be chaining themselves to trees. They'd be creating blockades so that the earth-moving machinery couldn't go about their business. And at the time, protesting was not really a thing in Australia. It had happened in the Vietnam War, opposing that, but in this case, environmental protesting was a pretty new thing to Australia. And the protesters were of the view that by building the dam, it would damage the wilderness of Tasmania, misplace animals, plants and the like, and that ultimately the area should be conserved. And people travelled from all over Australia to join the blockade, which was organised by the Australian Wilderness Society. In everyday life, the public seemed divided. Some were all green and opposed the dam on environmental grounds, and others were pro-dam because of the economical and financial reasons. Tasmania were entitled as a state. They're well within their rights to create a dam. But one of the ways that you can change a law is to bring attention to it as an interest group, and that's what they did with all of these protests, because if you don't bring attention to a matter or form an interest group, you can't really lobby politicians and change the law or legislation, because no one sort of knows about what it is that you want to change. And people became really passionate about saving the Franklin River. There were marches, protests, and all up there were about 1,400 arrests. People were really keen on stopping this dam. So those not in Tassie, they supported the cause by buying stickers or signing petitions. Even in the country town that I lived in, there were cars with stickers on the back saying, no dams, and it was quite surprising, really. And people that you would never expect were taking part in political rallies. Now, a lot of those people were dismissed as, raving hippies, which was kind of the thing back then, but they really had a valid point about if you built this, then you would be destroying things for centuries to come. And it was all about the long-term thinking. At the time, Australia only had about 3 main political groups, and the Greens, which were an environmental group, they were really only starting to make an impact. But when this issue came along about saving the Franklin River, musicians like Peter Garrett from the band Midnight Oil jumped on board as it aligned with the band's environmental and conservation ideals, and they really got involved and brought more and more attention to it. Peter actually went on to become a politician himself when he left the band Midnight Oil, and has now gone back, I think. But he made a real impact, and a lot of other people that were well known did as well. The leader of the Greens Party, Dr. Bob Brown, he said that flooding the Franklin would be like putting a scratch across the Mona Lisa. It would just be detrimental to the whole area. And not just the area where the Franklin River was, but to the whole state of Tasmania, which relies heavily on tourism, where people go just to see these beautiful things, because it really is a beautiful area of just wilderness. It's just gorgeous. But anyway, the protests gained momentum, and it soon became a bit of a political football. We already had the Greens involved, but now all of Australia was getting involved, and it was sort of a for and against type thing. A federal election was coming up, and Labor leader Bob Hawke started to build his election on the promise that he would stop the dam. And it was a pretty ballsy promise to make, but Bob Hawke was a pretty ballsy type of guy anyway. And I say it was a ballsy promise to make because he was going to be in the running to be Prime Minister of Australia in the federal government. But as I said, the state government has the power to make its own laws about getting a dam and building a dam. And the federal government doesn't have any control over that. So it didn't give him any power over the state of Tasmania or their proposed hydroelectricity scheme. There wasn't anything in the federal constitution that you could turn to say, I'll stop the dam. There wasn't any clause that says the federal government is in charge of electricity or hydroelectricity. So, how was he going to make good on the promise when the election was won? And I think we're all used to politicians, thank you Millie, that don't make good on promises, but this was a pretty big political issue, and this was one of his major election promises. So I'm just putting these little nail stickery things on her dress and just cutting them out with my nail scissors. I really need to buy some more scissors. I say that every time I use scissors, but really I'm just hopeless with scissors. I should go back to kindy and learn how to use scissors. One of the things under the federal constitution that the federal government could rely on was a power called external affairs power. Basically means that it's external to Australia. Up until this case, it had always been a bit of a head scratcher, to be honest, because some things you can naturally see would be included in this power. So, for example, war crimes committed in another country, but the criminal now resides in Australia, or relationships with passports or using passports. But it's also used for our relationships with other countries, especially when we've signed treaties or international conventions. So the whole point is, though, that this power relates to anything physically outside of Australia rather than within it. Before we go on, I should say that in 1974, Australia did sign the World Heritage Convention, which is external to Australia, and it requires all countries that sign that to protect items of world heritage. And just on Australia's constitution, I know some people may think it's a big fancy pants document that is very detailed and whatnot, but quite frankly, my supermarket catalogues are bigger than the Australian Constitution. Surprisingly, for a document that sets out our relationship between the federal government and the states and the power of the federal government, it's only itty bitty. As I said, my supermarket catalogues are bigger. And although it was drafted over several sessions at the pub, it's been surprisingly robust over the years, meaning that it's adapted to change and it's held up with very few changes to it. Although they did make it a little bit hard to change it when they drafted it up, clever little monkeys. But it actually has worked out quite well. It's quite difficult to change. The powers that are in it are, as I said, really quite robust. And when you think about it, this document was drafted for memory in 1899 and came into effect in, I think, 1901. I could be wrong, I'm half asleep. And when it was drafted, there were no planes, the internet was unheard of, and so many other things like hydroelectricity hadn't been heard of. But over the years, this little itty bitty document has been interpreted and adapted to cope with all of these changes, and it's done it really well. Back to Tasmania. In 1981, the government decided to submit the area where the Franklin River was to the World Heritage Site as an item of World Heritage significance. And it was actually declared as a World Heritage Site in 1982. And so this was an international convention and Australia was bound by it, and other places like the Great Barrier Reef are also part of the World Heritage Convention, as is the Grand Canyon for our friends across the pond. Although they're bound by a World Heritage Convention, that can't stop the construction of a state project. All it does is protect the area in order to stop the project and to facilitate the conservation of the area. it actually needs to be incorporated into Australian law as well as international law. So despite the listing, the Tasmanian government could still pass laws to start construction of the dam and start carrying out preliminary works to create this dam and this ultimate hydroelectric scheme. By 1983, Bob Hawke had won the election, and now it was time to come good with his election promises that he would intervene to stop the construction of the Franklin Dam. So after getting into office, the federal government passed the World Heritage Properties Conservation Act. And what that did was give the federal government power to stop clearing, excavation and other activities in the Tasmanian wilderness. This was inconsistent with what the state could do because, as I said, there was no power under the Constitution for the federal government to enact these laws. They can enact laws to protect things that are within a World Heritage listing, but they can't do things that basically stop what the Tasmanian government are entitled to do. Well, one would think. And when things are inconsistent with what the state can do, the Constitution's pretty clear on this, and it says basically if there's an inconsistency between federal and state, then the federal law wins, basically, to the extent of any inconsistency. Tasmania refused to stop construction, and they argued that the Commonwealth didn't have the power under the Constitution to stop the dam. Basically said put up or shut up. And they also said that only Tasmania could make a law about constructing a dam on the river. Now, the federal government had made this law, so now they needed to prove it in court what power under the Constitution they had to justify making the law. They can only use the powers that are set out in a section of the Constitution, mainly section 51, to stop. Because anything that isn't given power to the federal government is what's called ultra vires, meaning it's beyond their power and therefore it's not enforceable. So there were a few sections that they turned to. The one in relation to race power that could be used to protect Aboriginal heritage, and this was later used in a very famous case in Australia called Mabo. We'll talk about that one other day. They could have used another power that gave them power over corporations, companies, because the scheme could be a company, or they could use the external affairs power, that power where it's something physically outside of Australia, and the one that's always been a bit of a head scratcher until this case. So they went to the High Court, which is the only court that has the power to decide on constitutional issues in Australia, and they put forward the argument that the federal government had power under the external affairs powers in the Constitution because the site where the Franklin River was part of a World Heritage Convention and a World Heritage listing. And the High Court gave a brand new meaning to external affairs. It basically said that any matter covered by an international treaty signed by the Commonwealth Government was a law because it implemented the laws in existence of an international treaty, making it external to Australia. So the fact that it's an international treaty makes it physically external to Australia. Now, this was a really creative way of thinking, because if they hadn't first signed the World Heritage Convention and then got the listing for the Franklin River and then made the laws, then the state government of Tasmania would have just gone ahead and built the dam. So it was a very, very clever and creative sort of backdoor way of exercising a particular power under the Constitution that hadn't really been tested much in the courts. No one really knew the extent of this power, as other powers like corporations or trade and commerce, which are extensively tested. So it was extremely creative and also very lateral thinking about this whole process of getting this particular area of land listed in a international arena rather than within the state and then exercising that particular power. I think it's really clever. So in July of 1983, 4 of the 7 judges of the High Court upheld the validity of the Commonwealth laws which prevented the dam from being constructed. And although the decision was somewhat controversial and led to a lot of legal discussion about the external affairs power, it's now pretty well settled that the section gives power to the federal government to enact law that's reasonably capable of being correct to fulfil Australia's international obligations, including environmental protection. So even though the federal government didn't have any power, if there's a treaty, the Commonwealth can make a law about that power, which effectively gives the federal government more power over the states in a nice little roundabout way. So it's a little bit of a sneaky one, that one. At the end of the day, the Franklin Dam was stopped and the Commonwealth government gained a bit more power. We found out a little bit more about a power that had been underutilised in the Constitution. And Tasmania coped because it built more hydroelectric schemes and wind farms nowadays, and they coped and the Franklin River was saved. So at the end of the day, from a conservation point of view, it was all worth it. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'd be interested to know your point of view. Do you think it was a bit underhanded of the federal government to promise something that they technically didn't have the power to do? Or do you think, like me, it was pretty creative and lateral thinking in order to get something through that they didn't have the power to do? I'd be interested in knowing your points. I really like the creative approach. I've always said there's more than one way to skin a cat in law, and to me, Tasmanian Dam case sums that up, but I'm always interested to hear other people's view. But until next time, it is time for my nap, and stay safe and happy colouring.